1. The Phantom of the Subway. It was late on a cold winter night when Emily, a young tourist from Ohio, decided to take a stroll through Times Square. The lights were dazzling, and the streets were filled with the usual crowd of tourists, street performers, and vendors. But as midnight approached, the crowd began to thin, and an eerie quiet settled over the usually bustling area. Emily, unfamiliar with the city, decided to take the subway back to her hotel. She descended into the station, which was unusually empty for the time of night. As she waited for the train, she noticed an older man in tattered clothing standing at the far end of the platform, muttering to himself. His appearance was unsettling, but what caught Emily's attention were his eyes, cold, empty, and staring directly at her. The train arrived, and she quickly boarded, hoping to distance herself from the man. As the train sped through the tunnels, she noticed that the car was completely empty, except for one other passenger, a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, sitting quietly in the corner. Emily tried to ignore her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the train approached her stop, the lights flickered, and the air grew colder. The woman in the corner suddenly stood up, her eyes wide with fear. She pointed toward the door, and in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "He's coming." Emily's heart raced as she looked toward the door, expecting to see the old man from the platform. But the door opened, and no one was there. The train came to a stop, and Emily hurried off, desperate to escape the unsettling atmosphere. As she reached the exit, she glanced back at the platform. The old man was standing there, his eyes fixed on her. But this time, he was smiling, revealing a row of sharp, decaying teeth. Emily ran out of the station and didn't stop until she reached her hotel. She never returned to Times Square, and to this day, she can't explain what she experienced that night. 2. The Disappearing Crowd. Mark was a New Yorker, born and raised. He had seen all the city had to offer and was used to the strange occurrences that often happened in Times Square. But one night, as he made his way home after a late shift at work, he encountered something that shook him to his core. It was just past 2 a.m., and Times Square was surprisingly empty. The usual neon lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. As Mark walked through the square, he noticed a group of people gathered in a circle, silently staring at something on the ground. Curiosity piqued, he approached the group, but as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The people were all dressed in old, outdated clothing, as if they had stepped out of a different era. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes hollow. Mark called out to them, but no one responded. He felt a chill run down his spine as he noticed that the object they were staring at was a small, blood-stained doll. Suddenly, the crowd turned to face him, their movements synchronized and unnaturally slow. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, but the crowd began to advance toward him, their empty eyes locked on his. Panic set in, and Mark turned and ran, not stopping until he reached the safety of a nearby diner. When he looked back, the crowd was gone, the square once again empty. He told the diner staff what he had seen, but they dismissed it as fatigue or an overactive imagination. Mark never walked through Times Square at night again, and the memory of that eerie crowd still haunts him. 3. The Man with the Silver Cane. Times Square is known for its eclectic mix of characters, but none were as strange as the Man with the Silver Cane. Sarah, a local bartender, first noticed him one night while closing up. He stood across the street, dressed in an immaculate suit, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. The only thing that stood out was his silver cane, which he tapped rhythmically against the sidewalk. Night after night, Sarah would see him in the same spot, always watching, always tapping his cane. No one else seemed to notice him, and whenever she mentioned him to her co-workers, they would shrug it off, saying they had never seen anyone like that. One night, after finishing her shift, Sarah decided to confront the man. She crossed the street and approached him, her heart racing. As she got closer, she noticed that the air around him was unnaturally cold, and the sounds of the city seemed to fade away. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man lifted his head, revealing a face that was disturbingly featureless, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin. He raised his cane and pointed it directly at Sarah, who suddenly felt a sharp pain in her chest. She gasped and fell to the ground, her vision fading as the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah survived the encounter but was never the same. She quit her job and left the city, unable to shake the feeling that the man with the silver cane was still watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike again. 4. The Theater of the Damned. Times Square is famous for its theaters, but not all of them are filled with the joy of Broadway productions. There is one theater, long forgotten and hidden from plain sight, that is said to be cursed. In the early 1900s, the theater was the site of a terrible fire during a packed performance. Many lives were lost, and the building was abandoned, left to rot. Over the years, it became a place of urban legends, a theater where the spirits of the damned still performed, trapped in an eternal show of horror. Jake, a photographer with a passion for the paranormal, decided to explore the old theater after hearing rumors of ghostly sightings. He sneaked in one night, his camera ready to capture any evidence of the supernatural. As he wandered through the decaying hallways, he heard the faint sound of music, as if a performance was about to begin. Intrigued, he followed the sound to the main stage, where the old curtains were drawn and the seats were filled with shadowy figures. Jake watched in disbelief as the figures on stage began to move, acting out a gruesome play. The actors were pale, with hollow eyes and twisted expressions, their movements jerky and unnatural. The audience, if they could be called that, sat in silent rapture, their faces frozen in masks of terror. Realizing the danger, Jake tried to leave, but the theater doors were locked, and the shadowy figures began to turn toward him. He backed away, his heart pounding as the figures on stage slowly advanced, their twisted faces contorted into nightmarish grins. Jake's last memory was of the cold touch of a ghostly hand on his shoulder, pulling him into the darkness. His camera was found weeks later, lying on the steps of the theater, the last photo showing a blurry image of the cursed performance. 5. The Ghostly Taxi Ride. One of the most chilling urban legends in Times Square is that of the ghostly taxi. According to the story, on certain nights, if you're unlucky enough, you might hail a cab that will take you on a ride you'll never forget. Tom, a businessman visiting New York for a conference, was running late for a meeting. In his haste, he flagged down the first taxi he saw. The driver was an older man with a distant look in his eyes, and the cab smelled faintly of old leather and something else, something metallic. Tom gave the driver his destination, and the taxi took off at an alarming speed. As they drove through the city, Tom noticed that the streets seemed darker than usual, the buildings unfamiliar. The driver never spoke, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When they reached Times Square, the lights flickered, and Tom's unease grew. He asked the driver to stop, but the man ignored him, the taxi speeding up instead. The scenery outside the window began to change, becoming more twisted and distorted, as if they were driving through a nightmare. Panicking, Tom tried to open the door, but it was locked. The driver finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "No one leaves the ghostly taxi." The cab suddenly swerved into an alley, and the world outside turned pitch black. Tom's screams echoed in the darkness, but no one heard them. The taxi was found the next morning, parked on the side of the road, empty. Tom was never seen again, but some say that on certain nights, you can still see the ghostly taxi driving through Times Square, searching for its next passenger. 6. The Times Square Shadows. Times Square is known for its bright lights, but few people realize that where there is light, there are also shadows, shadows that sometimes seem to have a life of their own. Laura, a recent college graduate, had just moved to New York and was eager to experience all the city had to offer. One night, after a long day of job hunting, she decided to take a walk through Times Square, hoping the energy of the place would lift her spirits. As she walked among the flashing billboards and the bustling crowds, she started to feel uneasy. The lights, usually so vibrant, seemed dimmer, and the shadows cast by the towering buildings appeared to stretch unnaturally long. It wasn't long before Laura noticed that the shadows were not just reflections of the people and objects around her. They moved independently, sliding along the ground, creeping up walls, and slithering across the pavement as if they were alive. Trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, Laura quickened her pace, but the shadows seemed to follow her, growing darker and more defined. She turned to look behind her and saw them converging, forming a mass that began to take shape, a figure, tall and menacing, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. Panicked, Laura darted into a nearby coffee shop, her heart racing. Inside, the bright lights and the normalcy of the other patrons calmed her nerves, but when she glanced out the window, she saw the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the light, waiting. For the next few weeks, Laura avoided Times Square at night, but the feeling of being watched never left her. The shadows seemed to find her wherever she went, always lurking just out of sight. Eventually, she left New York, convinced that something in the city had marked her, something dark and malevolent that still waited for her in the shadows. 7. The Lost Tourists. Times Square is a magnet for tourists, but not all who visit leave with fond memories. In fact, some never leave at all. Jenna and Mike, a couple from Kansas, were visiting New York for the first time. They had heard all about the magic of Times Square and made it their first stop after checking into their hotel. The square was everything they had imagined, vibrant, chaotic, and full of life. But as the night wore on and the crowds began to thin, they realized they were lost. The familiar landmarks seemed to disappear, replaced by unfamiliar streets and dark alleyways. They asked for directions, but everyone they spoke to gave them different answers, leading them in circles. Frustrated and tired, they decided to head back to their hotel, but every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the labyrinth of the city. As midnight approached, they found themselves in a part of Times Square they had never seen before, dark, silent, and completely deserted. The billboards were blank, the neon signs flickered and buzzed, and there was an oppressive stillness in the air. The only sound was the distant echo of their footsteps. Suddenly, they heard a voice, soft and whispery, calling their names. They looked around but saw no one. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and they realized it was coming from behind them. They turned, but instead of seeing another person, they were confronted with their own reflections in a glass storefront, except their reflections were smiling back at them with a sinister grin. Panic set in and they ran, desperate to find their way back to the busy part of the square. But no matter which way they turned, they couldn't escape the dark, empty streets. The voice continued to call their names, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps, getting closer and closer. Eventually, the couple was found wandering near their hotel, dazed and confused, with no memory of how they got there. They left New York the next day, vowing never to return. But every night since, they've been haunted by the memory of that voice, the smile on their reflections, and the feeling that they never truly escaped. 8. The Midnight Train. New York's subway system is a world unto itself, but nowhere is it more unnerving than in the heart of Times Square. Derrick, a construction worker, had worked late one night and was on his way home, exhausted and eager for sleep. The subway platform at Times Square was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual chaos of the day. As Derrick waited for the train, he noticed something strange. The air was unusually cold, and there was a faint smell of smoke, like something was burning. He looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The train finally arrived, and he boarded, relieved to be on his way home. But as the train moved through the tunnels, Derrick noticed that the usual sounds, the rumble of the tracks, the hum of the lights, were absent. Instead, there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant sound of a woman sobbing. He looked around the car, but it was empty. Suddenly, the train came to a screeching halt in the middle of the tunnel. The lights flickered, and the sobbing grew louder. The doors opened, but instead of another platform, there was only darkness outside. The cold air rushed in, and Derrick felt a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. The sobbing stopped, replaced by a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "Get off the train." Derrick froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Get off the train." With great effort, Derrick forced himself to move, stepping out of the train and into the pitch-black tunnel. The doors closed behind him, and the train sped off, leaving him alone in the darkness. For what felt like hours, he wandered through the tunnel, the whispering voices growing louder, guiding him deeper into the underground maze. When Derrick was finally found, he was lying on the tracks, unconscious but unharmed. He had no memory of how he got there or what happened to him after he stepped off the train. But every night since, he dreams of that subway car, the voices, and the cold, dark tunnel that almost claimed him. 9. The Neon Glare. Times Square is famous for its dazzling neon lights, but for some, the lights are not just a spectacle, they are a curse. James, a successful ad executive, had always been drawn to Times Square's energy and vibrancy. He worked in an office overlooking the square and loved watching the lights come alive every evening. One night, after finishing a particularly stressful day at work, James decided to stay late and unwind by watching the lights. As he sat at his desk, staring out the window, he noticed something odd. The lights seemed brighter than usual, almost blindingly so. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the glare only intensified. The more he stared, the more the lights seemed to change. The vibrant colors began to swirl, forming strange patterns and shapes that danced before his eyes. And then he saw it, a face, twisted and malevolent, hidden within the neon. It was there for only a moment, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. James tried to look away, but his eyes were locked on the lights, unable to move. The face reappeared, this time closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. James could feel it staring into his soul, probing his mind, and he heard a voice, cold and mocking, "You can't look away, can you?" Panic set in, and James tore his gaze from the window, but the image of the face was burned into his mind. No matter where he looked, he saw it, in reflections, in shadows, even in his dreams. The once comforting lights of Times Square had become a source of terror, and James began to avoid the square entirely, taking different routes to work, and keeping his blinds closed at all times. But the face never left him, and over time, James became obsessed, convinced that the lights were watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He quit his job, moved to a different city, but the face followed him, a constant reminder of the neon glare that had stolen his peace of mind. 10. The silent performer. Street performers are a common sight in Times Square, but some performances are better left unseen. Sophia, an art student, was fascinated by the creativity and energy of the performers in Times Square. She often spent her evenings sketching them, capturing their movements and expressions in her notebook. One night, she noticed a new performer, a mime, dressed in a traditional black and white outfit with a face painted stark white. The mime was different from the others. His movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, and he never made a sound. He seemed to glide across the pavement, performing intricate routines that captivated the small crowd that had gathered around him. Sophia was drawn to the mime's performance, her pencil moving rapidly across the page as she tried to capture the essence of his movements. But as she watched, she noticed something strange. The mime's shadow didn't match his movements. While he danced and gestured, the shadow stood still, watching the crowd with a sinister intensity. As the performance continued, the shadow began to move on its own, independent of the mime. It stretched and warped, creeping closer to the spectators, who were oblivious to the dark figure that loomed over them. Sophia's heart raced as she realized that the shadow was not a part of the act. It was something else, something evil. She tried to warn the others, but her voice was lost in the crowd. The shadow continued to grow, enveloping the mime and the audience in darkness. And then, in the blink of an eye, the lights flickered, and the mime was gone, along with everyone who had been watching. Sophia was left standing alone in the square, her sketchbook clutched in her trembling hands. She never saw the mime again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting for his next audience. And every time she looks at the drawing she made that night, she sees the shadow, lurking in the background, a reminder of the performance that should never have happened. 11. The mirror in the alley Times Square is a place where past and present collide, and sometimes things from one era slip into another. Rebecca, a history enthusiast, was drawn to New York for its rich past. During her visit, she found herself exploring the lesser-known corners of Times Square, fascinated by the hidden remnants of old theaters and long-forgotten businesses. One evening, as she wandered through a narrow alleyway just off the main square, she stumbled upon an old, ornate mirror leaning against a wall. It was out of place among the modern buildings, its frame intricately carved with symbols and faces that seemed to watch her as she approached. Despite the dirt and grime that covered it, the mirror's surface was strangely pristine, reflecting the alley in perfect detail. Rebecca, unable to resist her curiosity, stepped closer and looked into the mirror. But what she saw wasn't just her reflection. It was the alley as it had been decades ago, bustling with people in vintage clothing, the sounds of an old-fashioned jazz band faintly echoing in the distance. Mesmerized, she watched as the scene played out before her, a window into a time long past. But as she continued to stare, the figures in the reflection began to notice her. They stopped what they were doing and turned to face the mirror, their expressions blank and unsettling. One by one, they began to move toward the glass, their eyes fixed on Rebecca. Panic set in as she realized they were not just reflections, they were trying to cross over. Rebecca tried to step back, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The figures reached the surface of the mirror, their hands pressing against the glass, causing it to ripple like water. The faces of the figures twisted into grotesque smiles as they began to push through, their bodies distorting and stretching as they entered the present. With a final burst of strength, Rebecca tore herself away from the mirror and ran out of the alley, not daring to look back. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, she realized she had left her purse behind, but she couldn't bring herself to return. The thought of facing whatever was in that mirror again was too terrifying. Rebecca left New York the next day, but the memory of that alley and the mirror haunted her. She could never forget the feeling of those cold eyes on her and the knowledge that something from the past had tried to follow her into the present. 12. The mannequin in the window. Times Square is full of strange sights, but nothing was as bizarre as the mannequin in the window of an old, abandoned storefront. Jessica, an aspiring photographer, was always on the lookout for interesting subjects, and the decaying buildings around Times Square provided the perfect backdrop for her work. One day, while exploring the area, she noticed a mannequin in the window of a long-closed department store. It was dressed in an outdated suit, its face blank and expressionless. But what caught Jessica's attention was the mannequin's pose. It was positioned as if it were waving, its hand raised in an unnatural stiff gesture. Intrigued, Jessica decided to take a closer look. She approached the window, her camera ready to capture the eerie scene. But as she peered through the dirty glass, she felt a chill run down her spine. The mannequin's head was tilted slightly toward her, and its eyes, which she hadn't noticed before, seemed to be following her every move. Jessica shook off the unease and took a few photos, but as she did, she noticed something even stranger. The mannequin was no longer waving. Its hand was now pressed against the glass, as if trying to reach out to her. She stepped back, her heart pounding, but the mannequin's face remained fixed on hers, its eyes growing more intense. Suddenly, the window began to fog up from the inside, and a message appeared, written in reverse on the glass. "Help me." Jessica gasped, stumbling back in shock. When she looked again, the mannequin was back in its original pose, the message gone, as if nothing had happened. Determined to capture the moment, Jessica snapped another photo, but when she reviewed the image on her camera, the mannequin was gone. The window was empty, and the store looked as abandoned as it had always been. Confused and terrified, Jessica fled the scene, leaving the strange mannequin behind. Over the following weeks, Jessica's photos began to show up in unexpected places, on her computer, on her phone, even printed out and slipped under her door. In each one, the mannequin was closer, its face more defined, and its eyes more lifelike. It was as if the mannequin was trying to reach her, to escape the confines of the abandoned store. Jessica eventually destroyed the photos, hoping to rid herself of the mannequin's haunting presence. But she could never shake the feeling that it was still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to reappear. 13. The cursed flyer. In Times Square, it's not unusual to be handed flyers by eager promoters, but one flyer in particular is said to be cursed. Danny, a college student visiting New York with friends, was exploring Times Square when a man approached him with a flyer. The man, dressed in tattered clothes and with a wild look in his eyes, insisted that Danny take it, saying it was an invitation to a special event. Curious, Danny accepted the flyer and glanced at it. The flyer was old and faded, with a date that was more than 50 years past. It advertised a show at a theater that no longer existed, promising an experience that would haunt your dreams. Danny laughed it off and stuffed the flyer in his pocket, thinking it was just a clever marketing gimmick. That night, Danny and his friends went out for dinner, but as they walked through the streets, he began to feel uneasy. He kept seeing the same man who had given him the flyer, lurking in the shadows, watching him with an unnerving intensity. The man never approached, but his presence was impossible to ignore. When Danny returned to his hotel, he took out the flyer again. The date had changed. It now showed the current day, and the location was listed as the very street his hotel was on. A sense of dread washed over him, but he couldn't explain why. That night, Danny had a vivid dream. He was back in Times Square, but the lights were dim and the crowds were gone. He followed the directions on the flyer to a small, run-down theater. Inside, the seats were filled with shadowy figures, and on the stage was the man who had given him the flyer, grinning with a malevolent gleam in his eyes. The man pointed to an empty seat in the front row, and despite his fear, Danny sat down. The show began, a grotesque and terrifying display that seemed to reach into his mind, dredging up his deepest fears and insecurities. The audience, now fully visible, were all people who had taken the flyer before him, their faces twisted in eternal terror. Danny awoke in a cold sweat, but the nightmare didn't end there. Every night, the dream returned, becoming more real, more horrifying. The flyer, which he tried to throw away, kept reappearing in his belongings, its message growing more insistent. Desperate to escape the curse, Danny left New York, but the dreams followed him. The flyer was always there, waiting for him, a constant reminder of the show he was now bound to attend, forever trapped in a nightmare that had begun in the heart of Times Square. 14. The Vanishing Artist. Street artists are a common sight in Times Square, their chalk drawings and paintings adding a splash of color to the concrete jungle. But one artist, known only as the Vanishing Artist, left behind a legacy of fear rather than beauty. Samantha, an art lover, had heard rumors about this mysterious figure who appeared at random, creating stunning works of art that would disappear without a trace. Intrigued, she decided to spend her Saturday in Times Square, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elusive artist. After hours of wandering, Samantha finally saw him, a tall, thin man with a weathered face, working intently on a large mural. The artwork was breathtaking, a swirling mix of colors and shapes that seemed to come alive on the wall. The crowd around him was mesmerized, but no one dared to speak to him, as if an invisible barrier kept them at a distance. Samantha watched in awe as the artist finished his work, stepping back to admire it. But just as she moved closer to get a better look, the man vanished right before her eyes. The crowd gasped, and when they looked back at the wall, the mural was gone, leaving only a blank, cracked surface. Shaken, Samantha left Times Square, but she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. That night, she dreamt of the mural, its colors vivid and its patterns shifting in her mind. But the dream took a dark turn when she saw the artist again, his face twisted with anger, pointing at her with accusing eyes. The next day, Samantha returned to the spot where the mural had been, but there was no trace of the artist or his work. As she stood there, a chill ran down her spine, and she felt a presence behind her. She turned, expecting to see the artist, but there was nothing, only the shadows of the buildings looming over her. Samantha began to see the artist everywhere, in reflections, in her dreams, even in the faces of strangers passing by. His gaze followed her, and the murals she had admired in Times Square started appearing in her nightmares, each one more twisted and disturbing than the last. No matter how far she ran, Samantha couldn't escape the vanishing artist. His presence haunted her, a reminder of the art she was never meant to see and the curse she now carried as a result. 15. The Times Square Siren. Among the many sounds of Times Square, the siren song is the most dangerous. Legend has it that a mysterious woman, known as the Times Square Siren, appears on certain nights, luring people to their doom with her haunting voice. Max, a musician, had always been fascinated by urban legends, and when he heard about the siren, he was determined to find out if the stories were true. Armed with his guitar, he set out one night to explore Times Square, hoping to encounter the legendary figure. As midnight approached, Max heard the first notes of a melody drifting through the air. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, beautiful, mournful, and irresistible. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, drawing him deeper into the square. He followed the music to a secluded corner, where a woman stood beneath a flickering street lamp. She was dressed in a flowing gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders, and her eyes were dark pools of mystery. She sang softly, her voice weaving a spell that Max couldn't resist. Entranced, Max approached her, his guitar forgotten at his side. The closer he got, the more the world around him faded away, until there was nothing but her voice and the promise of something beyond his understanding. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and menace, and reached out her hand. But as Max took her hand, the melody changed, becoming harsh and discordant. The siren's face twisted into a mask of rage, and the world around them erupted into chaos. The street lamps shattered, the buildings around them crumbled, and the ground beneath Max's feet began to crack and fall away. He tried to pull back, but the siren's grip was unbreakable. She pulled him closer, her voice now a scream that echoed through his mind, drowning out all reason. Just as he was about to be consumed by the darkness, Max found himself standing in the middle of Times Square, the noise and lights of the city returning in an instant. But something had changed. Max was no longer the same. The siren's song had left a mark on him, a constant whisper in the back of his mind, calling him back to the place where he had almost lost his soul. No matter where he went, the melody followed him, a haunting reminder of the night he encountered the Times Square siren. 16. The Ghost of the Astor Hotel. The Astor Hotel, once a grand symbol of luxury in Times Square, has long been demolished, but its ghostly legacy remains. During its heyday, the hotel was the site of countless lavish parties and high society gatherings. But it was also the site of tragedy. A young woman, jilted by her lover, took her own life in one of the hotel's suites, and her spirit is said to still haunt the area. Melissa, a history student with a passion for ghost stories, was fascinated by the tale of the Astor Hotel. She decided to visit the site where the hotel once stood, hoping to experience something supernatural. She arrived late at night, the square still bustling with activity, but she felt an eerie stillness as she approached the spot. As she stood there, trying to imagine what the hotel must have looked like, she felt a sudden chill, as if a cold hand had brushed against her skin. The noise of the city faded, and she heard the faint sound of music, like an old gramophone playing a waltz from a bygone era. Melissa turned, and to her astonishment, she saw the grand lobby of the Astor Hotel materializing before her eyes. The opulent chandeliers, the elegant guests in their evening attire, and the gilded decor all appeared as if they had stepped out of time. But something was wrong. The guests moved with a ghostly grace, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow. In the center of the room, Melissa saw her. A young woman in a white gown, her face streaked with tears, standing alone as the spectral figures danced around her. The woman looked directly at Melissa, her eyes filled with despair and longing, as if begging for help. Before Melissa could react, the vision vanished, leaving her standing alone in the cold night air. The music faded, and the bustling sounds of Times Square returned, but the memory of the ghostly scene lingered. Melissa left the site, but she couldn't forget the young woman's face, or the overwhelming sadness that had filled her eyes. She began to research the Astor Hotel's history, trying to learn more about the woman and her tragic end. But the more she uncovered, the more she felt drawn back to that spot, as if the ghost was calling her, seeking closure for a life cut short. Every night, Melissa returned to Times Square, hoping to see the ghost again, to find out what she wanted. But the vision never reappeared, leaving Melissa with the haunting memory of the Astor Hotel and the ghostly woman trapped in its past. 17. The Living Statue. Street performers in Times Square are a common sight, but some performances are not what they seem. Alex, a frequent visitor to New York, was always amazed by the living statues, performers who stand motionless for hours, painted in metallic hues, blending perfectly with their surroundings. One evening, while waiting for a friend, Alex noticed a new statue he hadn't seen before. The performer was painted in a deep bronze, standing on a pedestal with an expression of calm serenity. Something about this statue was different. It seemed more lifelike, its eyes almost too real, following the movements of the crowd. Curious, Alex approached the statue and noticed a plaque at its base. It read, "The Man Who Never Moves." The title intrigued him, and he tossed a few coins into the performer's hat, hoping to see some movement, but the statue remained perfectly still. As Alex turned to walk away, he felt a strange sensation, as if the statue was watching him. He glanced back, and to his shock, the statue's head had turned slightly in his direction, its eyes now locked onto his. Unease crept over him, but he tried to brush it off as a trick of the light. Later that night, as Alex walked through the streets of Times Square, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time he looked around, he He saw nothing unusual, but the sensation persisted. When he finally arrived at his hotel, he felt a chill run down his spine as he noticed a figure standing at the corner of the street, the living statue in the same pose, watching him from the shadows. Panicked, Alex rushed inside, but the image of the statue haunted him. He didn't sleep that night, convinced that the statue would be waiting for him in the morning. And when he finally gathered the courage to leave his hotel, he found the street empty, the statue nowhere to be seen. But the encounter left Alex changed. Everywhere he went, he saw statues on street corners, in parks, even in his dreams. They all had the same lifelike eyes, the same unnerving presence, as if they were watching him, waiting for something. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur, and Alex found himself questioning whether the statues were performers at all, or something far more sinister. 18. The Forgotten Underground. Beneath the glittering lights of Times Square lies a network of forgotten tunnels and abandoned subway stations, places that the city has left behind, but that have not forgotten the people who once passed through them. Paul, an urban explorer with a fascination for the hidden parts of New York, had heard rumors of a secret subway line that ran beneath Times Square, long since closed and abandoned. Determined to find it, he spent weeks researching old maps and talking to locals who knew the city's history. One night, Paul finally found what he was looking for, a rusted gate leading to a forgotten stairwell, hidden behind a crumbling wall near one of the busier subway entrances. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, he descended into the darkness, eager to document his discovery. The stairwell led to an old platform, covered in dust and graffiti, the remnants of a bygone era. As Paul explored, he felt a strange sense of unease, as if the tunnels were alive, watching him. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around him. As he moved deeper into the tunnels, Paul heard a sound, a faint, echoing whisper that seemed to come from all directions. He paused, trying to locate the source, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and Paul saw them, figures moving in the darkness, their faces obscured, their movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged through him, and he turned to run, but the figures were everywhere, closing in on him, blocking his way. The whispers became voices, clear and accusatory, echoing through the tunnels. "You don't belong here," they said. "This is our place, and you are not welcome." Paul's heart raced as he stumbled through the darkness, desperately searching for a way out. The figures followed, their presence growing stronger, more oppressive, until Paul felt as though he was suffocating under their gaze. Just when he thought he would never escape, Paul found the stairwell and bolted up the steps, bursting out into the cool night air of Times Square. He collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, but the voices and the figures were gone, leaving him shaken and terrified. Paul never spoke of what he saw in the tunnels, but he never returned to Times Square. The experience haunted him, a reminder that some places are forgotten for a reason, and some secrets are better left buried in the darkness. 19. The Phantom Bus. Times Square is always bustling with traffic, but among the sea of yellow taxis and flashing lights, there is one vehicle that locals whisper about in hushed tones, the Phantom Bus. According to the legend, this bus appears only late at night, and those who board it are never seen again. Katie, a college student pulling an all-nighter at her university library, missed the last subway home and found herself stranded in Times Square. The streets were unusually quiet, and the few remaining buses had long since stopped running. Just as she was about to call for a ride, she saw a bus approaching. The bus was old, with peeling paint and a sign that read "Special Route" instead of a destination. Exhausted and desperate to get home, Katie flagged it down. The doors creaked open, and she was met by the driver, a man in a dark uniform with a shadowy face, his eyes hidden under the brim of his cap. Without thinking, Katie boarded the bus and found it almost empty, except for a few passengers who sat in eerie silence. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling stillness filled the space. She chose a seat near the front, but as soon as the bus started moving, she noticed something strange. The city outside the windows didn't look right. The streets were unfamiliar, the buildings dark and decayed, as if they had been abandoned for years. Katie's unease grew as the bus continued to travel through what seemed like a ghostly version of New York. The passengers around her remained silent, their faces blank and expressionless. She tried to ask the driver where they were going, but he only muttered something unintelligible, his eyes never leaving the road. The bus began to pick up speed, careening through the desolate streets. Katie's heart raced as she realized she needed to get off, but the doors wouldn't open and the windows were sealed shut. Panic set in, and she frantically looked for an emergency exit, but there was none. Suddenly, the bus swerved and plunged into a tunnel, the lights inside flickering. The sound of the engine grew louder, almost deafening, and Katie felt as though the walls were closing in on her. The other passengers finally reacted, their heads turning toward her in unison, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Desperate, Katie closed her eyes and braced for the worst. But when she opened them again, she was standing alone on the sidewalk in Times Square, the phantom bus nowhere to be seen. The city was back to normal, the streets alive with people and noise, as if nothing had happened. Shaken, Katie quickly hailed a taxi and left the area. She never spoke of the experience to anyone, but she could never forget the feeling of being trapped on that bus, surrounded by shadows and lost souls. And every time she passed through Times Square at night, she couldn't help but glance around, half expecting to see the phantom bus appear once more. 20. The disappearing tour guide. Tour guides in Times Square are a common sight, offering stories and histories of the city that never sleeps. But one guide, known as Old Jack, has a story all his own, a tale that has left many who encounter him questioning reality itself. Jack was an elderly man with a kind smile and a voice full of charisma. He had been giving tours of Times Square for decades, his knowledge of the area unmatched. Tourists flocked to him, eager to hear his stories of old New York, of the days when the square was a hub of theaters and glamour. One summer evening, a group of tourists gathered around Jack for one of his famous midnight tours. He began with his usual charm, regaling them with tales of the square's history, pointing out landmarks that had long since been demolished. The group followed him eagerly, hanging on his every word. But as the tour continued, something strange began to happen. The lights of Times Square grew dim, and the usual bustling crowds seemed to thin out. The streets became quieter, the neon signs flickering as if they were about to go out. The group started to feel uneasy, but Jack reassured them, saying it was all part of the city's mysterious charm. Jack led them down an alley that none of them recognized, despite having walked through Times Square earlier. The buildings were older, their facades crumbling, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The group hesitated, but Jack urged them on, promising a glimpse of the real New York, the city that once was. As they ventured deeper into the alley, the group noticed that their phones had lost signal, and the city sounds were now distant echoes. They began to question whether they should continue, but Jack's voice, calm and persuasive, kept them moving forward. Finally, they reached a small, dilapidated theater, its marquee flickering with a name none of them recognized. Jack stopped in front of it and turned to face the group, his expression suddenly serious. "This," he said, "is where it all ends." Before the group could react, Jack stepped inside the theater and disappeared into the darkness. The tourists, now thoroughly spooked, tried to follow, but when they opened the door, the theater was empty, its interior completely abandoned and covered in dust. There was no sign of Jack or anyone else. Panicking, the group ran back to the main square, only to find themselves in the middle of modern Times Square, the lights bright and the crowds as lively as ever. Confused and disoriented, they asked around about Old Jack, but no one had heard of him. When they returned the next day to look for the alley and the theater, they found nothing but the usual bustling streets of Times Square. The story of Old Jack spread among tourists and locals alike, becoming another urban legend in a city full of mysteries. Some say he was a ghost, leading people on a journey through a forgotten part of New York. Others believe he was a trickster, playing with the minds of the unsuspecting. But those who experienced his tour know one thing for certain: once you meet Old Jack, you never forget him. And the memory of that strange night in Times Square will haunt you forever. 21. The Silent Shouter. In a city as noisy as New York, silence can be as unsettling as a scream. One night, as the clock struck midnight, a man known as the Silent Shouter appeared in the heart of Times Square, his presence marked by an eerie calm that defied the chaos around him. Thomas, a night owl by nature, was out for a late-night walk, enjoying the relative quiet of Times Square at that hour. He noticed the man almost immediately, standing motionless in the middle of the square, his hands cupped around his mouth as if he were shouting, but no sound came out. Curious, Thomas approached the man, who was dressed in a simple suit, his face pale and expressionless. Despite his silent stance, it was clear the man was trying to communicate something urgent. His eyes were wide with fear, and his mouth moved as if he were screaming, but the silence was absolute. Thomas felt a chill as he realized the noise of Times Square had faded away, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. The man's silent scream became more frantic, his hands trembling as he continued to shout without a voice. Suddenly, Thomas noticed the people around him starting to act strangely. They were moving slower, their expressions vacant, as if they were in a trance. Some began to mimic the man's actions, cupping their hands around their mouths, their faces contorted in silent agony. Panic gripped Thomas as he tried to escape the square, but the air felt thick, almost tangible, as if he were wading through water. The man's silent scream grew louder in his mind, a deafening roar that threatened to overwhelm him. Just as Thomas thought he couldn't take it anymore, the man suddenly stopped, his hands falling to his sides. The noise of the city returned in a rush, the lights flaring brightly, and the square returned to normal. The man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Thomas was left standing in the middle of Times Square, shaken and confused. He tried to tell people what he had seen, but no one believed him. The silent shouter became just another strange story, whispered among those who dared to stay out late in the city that never sleeps. But Thomas knew what he had experienced was real, and he could still hear that silent scream echoing in his mind, a reminder that in a city full of noise, silence can be the most terrifying sound of all. 22. The Times Square Ghost Train. In the early days of New York's subway system, an accident in Times Square claimed the lives of dozens of passengers when a train derailed in the station. While the station was rebuilt and modernized, stories persist of a ghost train that appears late at night, carrying the lost souls who perished in the crash. Ethan, a subway conductor with years of experience, had heard the stories but never gave them much thought. That was until one fateful night, when his usual route through Times Square took a dark and unexpected turn. It was after midnight, and the station was nearly empty as Ethan's train pulled in. As he waited for the few remaining passengers to board, he noticed an old, rusted train slowly pulling into the adjacent track. The train looked like it belonged in a museum, with faded lettering and shattered windows, but what struck Ethan most was the fact that it was completely silent, no rumbling of wheels, no screeching brakes, just an eerie stillness. The doors of the ghostly train slid open, and to Ethan's horror, passengers began to step out. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes vacant. They moved in slow, deliberate steps, as if in a trance, and boarded Ethan's train without a sound. Frozen in place, Ethan watched as the ghostly passengers filled the carriages, their presence chilling the air. When the last passenger boarded, the doors closed, and the ghost train disappeared as silently as it had arrived. Ethan felt a jolt as his own train started moving, though he hadn't touched the controls. The train sped through the tunnels at a terrifying speed, the lights flickering wildly. The ghostly passengers remained motionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Desperate to regain control, Ethan tried to stop the train, but the controls wouldn't respond. The tunnels outside the windows twisted and distorted, becoming a dark, endless void. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized the train was no longer on the normal tracks. It was heading somewhere else, somewhere unknown. Just as the fear threatened to consume him, the train abruptly came to a halt in a pitch-black tunnel. The ghostly passengers stood up in unison and slowly exited the train, disappearing into the darkness without a word. When the last passenger was gone, the lights flickered back on, and the train returned to the familiar tracks of the subway system. Ethan found himself back in Times Square station, the ghost train gone and the platform empty. Shaken, Ethan reported the incident to his superiors, but they dismissed it as a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But Ethan knew what he had seen was real, and every time he passed through Times Square station, he couldn't help but glance at the empty tracks, wondering if the ghost train would return, and if the souls it carried would ever find peace. 23. The Eternal Street Musician. Times Square is filled with the sounds of street musicians, their melodies adding a vibrant energy to the city. But among them is one musician who plays a tune that no one forgets, a tune that haunts those who hear it long after they leave. Sam, a regular visitor to Times Square, had always enjoyed the music of the city. One evening, as he strolled through the square, he heard a hauntingly beautiful melody drifting through the air. The music was unlike anything he had ever heard, filled with a deep sorrow that tugged at his heart. Following the sound, Sam found the source, a man sitting on a worn stool, playing a violin that looked as old as the city itself. The musician was dressed in ragged clothes, his eyes closed as he played with an intensity that seemed to transport him to another world. The crowd around him was unusually silent, captivated by the music. As Sam listened, he felt a profound sadness wash over him, as if the music was telling a story of loss and despair. He tried to walk away, but the melody held him in place, drawing him closer. When the musician finished playing, he opened his eyes and looked directly at Sam. His gaze was piercing, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo the music. Without a word, the musician stood up, leaving his violin behind, and disappeared into the crowd. Sam, unable to resist, picked up the violin, intending to return it to the musician. But as soon as he touched the instrument, the melody filled his mind, overwhelming him with emotion. He tried to play, but the violin strings snapped under his fingers, the music cutting off abruptly. From that night on, Sam was haunted by the musician's melody. It played in his mind, a constant, mournful tune that he couldn't escape. He searched for the musician, hoping to return the violin and rid himself of the haunting melody, but the man was nowhere to be found. The violin, now silent and broken, remained in Sam's possession, a reminder of the encounter. And though he tried to forget, the music never left him. A ghostly tune that followed him wherever he went, a melody that would play on, eternally, in the heart of Times Square. 24. The Times Square lantern bearer. In the early 1900s, before the advent of electricity, Times Square was lit by gas lamps, and the lantern bearers were a common sight, lighting the lamps each evening. But one lantern bearer, known only as the Watcher, never left his post, even after the lights were gone. Clara, a historian with a passion for New York's past, was researching the old lantern bearers of Times Square. One evening, while walking through the square, she spotted a man in old-fashioned clothing, carrying a lantern that glowed with a soft, warm light. Intrigued, Clara followed him as he moved through the square, lighting imaginary lamps with a practiced motion. The man seemed completely unaware of the modern world around him, lost in his own time. As Clara drew closer, she noticed that the lantern emitted no heat, and the light didn't cast any shadows. The man's face was gaunt and pale, his eyes empty and distant. Despite the bustling crowds, no one else seemed to see him. Clara called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he continued his task, moving from one invisible lamp to the next. Determined to learn more, Clara approached him and asked who he was. The man finally stopped and turned to face her. His eyes, once dull, now glowed with a strange light, and he spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from a distant past. "I am the last lantern bearer," he said. "I watch over the square, lighting the way for those who cannot find it." Before Clara could ask more, the man vanished, leaving only the faint glow of his lantern in the air. She searched the square but found no trace of him. The encounter left her shaken, but it also sparked a deeper curiosity about the history of Times Square and the people who had lived there long ago. Clara continued her research, but she never found any records of the lantern bearer she had seen. The experience remained a mystery, one that haunted her dreams and left her with a lingering sense of unease. And every time she passed through Times Square at night, she couldn't help but look for the glow of the lantern, wondering if the Watcher was still there, lighting the way for those lost in the shadows of time. 25. The Stolen Faces. Times Square is a place where millions of faces blend together in the bustling crowd, but among them is a sinister presence that seeks to steal those faces. The legend of the face stealer is whispered among locals, a being that can take on the appearance of anyone it encounters, leaving its victims blank and faceless. Lena, an actress trying to make her big break in New York, had heard the stories but never believed them. One evening, after a long day of auditions, she found herself in Times Square, exhausted and frustrated. As she pushed through the crowd, she noticed someone watching her, a woman standing perfectly still, her face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine as the woman slowly lifted her head, revealing a face that was eerily similar to her own. The woman's eyes met Lena's, and for a moment, Lena felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if she were staring into a distorted mirror. Shaking off the unease, Lena hurried away, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. As she moved through the square, she began to see more and more people who looked exactly like her, their faces twisted into unnatural smiles, their eyes following her every move. Panicking, Lena broke into a run, but the doppelgangers seemed to multiply, appearing in every direction, closing in on her. She darted into a side street, hoping to escape, but found herself face to face with the woman in the hat once again. This time, the woman's face was completely blank, smooth, featureless skin where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Lena screamed, but no sound came out. She reached up to her own face and felt nothing. Her features had disappeared, leaving her faceless like the woman before her. In a final, desperate act, Lena ran into a nearby building and locked herself in a restroom. She looked in the mirror and saw nothing but a blank void where her face used to be. The horror of what she had become overwhelmed her, and she collapsed to the floor, weeping silently. The next morning, Lena was found wandering the streets, her face restored, but her memory of the night gone. She couldn't explain what had happened, or why she felt an unshakable fear every time she looked in the mirror. The face stealer had taken something from her, something she couldn't get back, and left her with a haunting reminder of the night her identity was nearly stolen forever. 26. The Eternal Tourist. Tourists flock to Times Square from all over the world, but there is one tourist who has never left. Known only as the Eternal Tourist, he is said to be a man who arrived in New York decades ago and has been wandering the streets of Times Square ever since, unable to find his way home. Michael, a photographer documenting the people of Times Square, first noticed the man one rainy evening. The tourist was dressed in outdated clothing, carrying an old suitcase and wearing a lost, bewildered expression. He seemed to be asking for directions, but everyone he approached either ignored him or couldn't understand him. Intrigued, Michael decided to follow the man, hoping to capture a unique story. The tourist moved slowly, his eyes scanning the crowds as if searching for something familiar. Despite the rain, he showed no sign of being wet or cold, his clothes dry and clean as if untouched by the elements. As the night wore on, Michael watched as the man continued his fruitless search. He approached strangers, only to be met with confusion or indifference. No one seemed to notice the man's increasing desperation, his face growing more fallen with each failed attempt. Eventually, the tourist sat down on a bench, his suitcase beside him, and buried his face in his hands. Michael, feeling a pang of sympathy, decided to approach him. But when he did, the man looked up, and Michael was struck by the emptiness in his eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow. The tourist tried to speak, but his words were garbled, a mix of languages that made no sense. Michael realized that the man was speaking in tongues long forgotten, his voice a whisper of the past. The realization sent a chill through Michael, and he stepped back, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the man stood up, his expression now one of resignation. He picked up his suitcase and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been there. Michael tried to follow, but the tourist was gone, leaving no trace behind. The next day, Michael searched for the man, asking around and showing his photograph to others, but no one had seen him. The image Michael had captured showed only an empty bench, the suitcase, and the man nowhere to be seen. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the eternal tourist was still out there, wandering the streets of Times Square, forever lost in a city that had moved on without him. The story of the eternal tourist became another ghostly tale in Michael's collection, a reminder that some souls are trapped in time, never able to find their way home. 27. The Ghostly Marquee. Times Square is known for its towering marquees and bright lights, but one marquee is said to display messages from beyond the grave. The Ghostly Marquee is an urban legend that tells of a theater long since demolished, where the spirits of its former patrons still gather to see shows that never end. Eleanor, a theater enthusiast, had heard the legend of the Ghostly Marquee and was determined to see it for herself. One night, as she strolled through Times Square, she noticed a flickering sign above an old building that was slated for demolition. The marquee displayed the name of a play she didn't recognize, The Last Curtain, in faded letters that seemed to glow in the darkness. Intrigued, Eleanor approached the theater, its doors cracked open as if inviting her inside. She hesitated for a moment, but couldn't resist the pull of the mysterious play. Pushing open the doors, she stepped into the dimly lit lobby, the air thick with dust and the scent of age. The theater was empty, its seats covered in a thin layer of dust, but the stage was set, the curtains drawn as if a performance was about to begin. Eleanor found a seat near the front and waited, her heart pounding with anticipation. As the lights dimmed further, the curtains slowly opened, revealing a group of actors on stage. They were dressed in old-fashioned costumes, their faces pale and expressionless. The play began, but the dialogue was strange, disjointed, as if the actors were reciting lines from different plays all at once. Eleanor watched in confusion as the performance continued, the actors moving in a slow, dreamlike manner. Suddenly, one of them looked directly at her, their eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach into her soul. The actor extended a hand toward Eleanor, as if pleading for help, but she was frozen in her seat, unable to move. The play continued, growing more chaotic and disturbing with each passing minute. The actors began to repeat the same lines over and over, their voices rising to a fever pitch. The theater around Eleanor seemed to close in, the walls warping and the ceiling lowering as if the building itself was collapsing. Just as she thought she couldn't take any more, the curtains abruptly closed and the theater fell into complete darkness. Eleanor's heart raced as she felt the presence of the actors all around her, their breath cold against her skin. She jumped up from her seat and ran for the exit, the sound of applause following her, though there was no audience to make it. She burst out of the theater and into the bright lights of Times Square, gasping for breath. When she looked back, the theater was gone, replaced by a construction site, the marquee no longer visible. Eleanor never spoke of what she had seen, but the memory haunted her. She avoided Times Square after that, unable to forget the ghostly play and the sorrowful actors trapped in a performance that would never end. The ghostly marquee became more than just a legend to her. It was a reminder that some theaters never truly close, and some shows never stop playing. 28. The vanishing performer. Street performers are a common sight in Times Square, but there is one performer whose act is unlike any other, a magician who appears out of nowhere, performs impossible feats, and then vanishes without a trace. Liam, an aspiring magician, had heard of the vanishing performer, a legendary figure among those in the magic community. One night, while walking through Times Square, he spotted a small crowd gathered around a man dressed in a tattered suit, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. The man was performing magic unlike anything Liam had ever seen. He pulled live birds from thin air, made objects disappear with a wave of his hand, and even seemed to stop time itself, all without a single prop or assistant. The crowd was mesmerized, but there was something unsettling about the performer's movements, too smooth, too precise, as if he were more than human. Liam pushed his way to the front, eager to learn the secrets behind the tricks. As he watched, the magician turned his attention to Liam, as if sensing his presence. The man's eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto Liam's, and he beckoned him closer. "Do you want to learn the greatest trick of all?" the magician asked in a voice that sent chills down Liam's spine. Liam nodded, unable to resist the pull of the mysterious performer. The magician smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, and handed Liam a small ornate box. "Open it," he said. Liam hesitated but eventually opened the box, only to find it empty. Confused, he looked up, but the magician was gone. The crowd dispersed as if they had never been there. The box, now heavy in his hands, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. From that moment on, Liam's life changed. The box became his obsession, its secrets eluding him, no matter how hard he tried to understand it. He found himself performing magic that defied explanation, tricks that no one else could replicate. But with each performance, he felt a piece of himself slipping away, as if the box was draining his very soul. Liam tried to rid himself of the box, but it always returned, waiting for him wherever he went. The vanishing performer had passed on his greatest trick, but it came at a terrible cost, a curse that bound Liam to the box and the magic within it, forever trapped in a performance that would never end. 29. The Clockwork Man. Times Square is a place where time seems to move at its own pace, but one night, a man known as the Clockwork Man appeared, bringing with him a sense of time that was anything but normal. Julia, an architect working on a project in the city, was burning the midnight oil when she decided to take a break and walk through Times Square. The lights were still bright, the crowds thinner but still present, and the city's pulse as strong as ever. As she walked, Julia noticed a man standing in the center of the square, dressed in an old-fashioned suit and holding a large pocket watch. The man was turning the watch's dial, his movements precise and mechanical, like a wind-up toy. Curious, Julia approached him and noticed that the watch's hands were spinning rapidly, faster than any clock she had ever seen. The man looked up at her, his eyes cold and unblinking, and said in a flat, emotionless voice, "Time is running out." Julia felt a sudden sense of unease, as if the world around her was shifting. She looked around and noticed that the people in Times Square were moving in strange patterns. Some were speeding up, others slowing down, and a few seemed frozen in place, their faces locked in expressions of surprise or fear. The man continued to turn the watch's dial, and with each twist, the distortions in time grew more severe. Julia's heart raced as she felt herself being pulled into the strange time warp, her body struggling to keep up with the rapid changes. "Stop," she shouted, but the man ignored her, his focus entirely on the watch. Desperate, Julia lunged at him, trying to grab the watch from his hands. But as soon as she touched it, the world around her dissolved into a blur of colors and sounds. She felt herself falling through time, tumbling through a void where past, present, and future collided in a chaotic whirl. When she finally regained consciousness, Julia found herself lying on the ground in the middle of Times Square. The lights were dim, the crowds gone, and the city eerily quiet. She looked at her watch and saw that hours had passed, though it felt like only minutes. The Clockwork Man was nowhere to be seen, but his words echoed in her mind. "Time is running out." Julia returned to her office, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world seemed off-kilter, as if time itself had been altered by her encounter with the Clockwork Man. From that day on, she noticed strange anomalies, clocks that wouldn't keep time, people who seemed out of place, and a sense of disorientation that never left her. Julia knew that the Clockwork Man was still out there, somewhere in the city, manipulating time in ways she couldn't understand. And she couldn't help but wonder when he would return, and what would happen when time finally ran out for good. 30. The Silent Dance. Times Square is known for its flash mobs and spontaneous performances, but there is one dance that no one dares to join. The silent dance is a mysterious phenomenon that occurs only on certain nights when the clock strikes midnight, and those who witness it are left with an unease that lingers long after the music has stopped. Olivia, a dancer newly arrived in New York, had heard about the silent dance from a fellow performer. The story intrigued her. A dance that happened without music, where the participants moved in perfect sync, as if guided by an unseen force. Determined to see it for herself, Olivia set out for Times Square one crisp autumn night, hoping to witness the event. As midnight approached, the usual hustle of Times Square began to die down, the crowds thinning as people hurried home. Olivia stood near the center of the square, her breath visible in the cool air, waiting for something to happen. Just as she began to think the story was nothing more than a myth, she noticed a group of people slowly gathering around her. They appeared ordinary at first, tourists, locals, even a few street performers she recognized. But as the clock struck midnight, a strange silence fell over the square. The ever-present hum of the city seemed to vanish, replaced by an eerie stillness. The lights dimmed, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the group began to move. Without a single note of music, the people around Olivia started to dance. Their movements were graceful, fluid, and perfectly synchronized, yet there was something unsettling about the way they moved, too smooth, too mechanical, as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes blank as they swayed and twirled in unison. Olivia, entranced by the scene, found herself stepping closer, her own feet itching to join in. But as she watched, she realized that the dancers were not simply moving together, they were moving as one. Their limbs twisted and bent in impossible ways, their bodies merging and separating in a seamless flow that defied logic. Fear gripped Olivia as she noticed that the dancers' shadows on the ground didn't match their movements. The shadows seemed to dance on their own, swirling and intertwining in dark, unnatural patterns. The realization sent a chill down her spine. This was no ordinary dance. One of the dancers suddenly turned and looked directly at Olivia, his eyes locking onto hers. His face, once ordinary, began to change, his features warping and shifting into a grotesque mask of pain and despair. The other dancers followed suit, their faces contorting into similar expressions as they reached out toward her, beckoning her to join them. Terrified, Olivia tried to back away, but the dancers were all around her, their movements growing faster and more frenzied. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on her as the dance reached a fever pitch. The shadows on the ground stretched and clawed at her feet, pulling her toward the center of the square. Just as Olivia felt herself being drawn into the dance, the clock struck 12:01 and the spell was broken. The lights of Times Square fled back to life, the sounds of the city returned, and the dancers abruptly stopped. They stood still for a moment, their faces returning to normal, before silently dispersing into the night, leaving Olivia alone in the square. Shaken, Olivia stumbled away from the scene, her heart racing. She never spoke of what she had seen, but she couldn't forget the silent dance, or the feeling of those cold, blank eyes staring into her soul. From that night on, she avoided Times Square after dark, knowing that the dance could happen again at any time, and that the next time she might not be able to resist the pull.